Okay, hello everybody, welcome. Welcome esteemed panel. I'm Rana Faruhar. I am an associate editor and columnist of the Financial Times, and I am delighted to be here moderating this panel with Heather Boushey, who is a member of the President's Council on Economic Advisors, co-founder of the Center for Equitable Growth, and Felicia Wong, who is president and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute, our host today. You guys have been at the epicenter of all of this for decades, actually, and what's new is actually old in some ways. I mean, you know, we've all been at this for a while. I want to talk a little bit about the paradigm change that we're going through, and in particular, I want to talk about the word neoliberalism, because you're going to be hearing that word a lot, and it's sort of thrown around, and even in DC, I find that people don't always have the same idea about what we're talking about. So let me scene set a little bit about where we've been, and in particular the neoliberal paradigm, and where we're headed into this post-neoliberal world, this world of Bidenomics, this world of industrial policy that we're hearing about. I'll give a quick self-promotional plug. I actually have a book coming out on October 18th called Homecoming: The Path to Prosperity in a Post-Global World. And it's really touching on everything that we're talking about here. I think that we are moving into a post-neoliberal, post-globalized world. Not that globalization is going away, but we're going to see much more of a focus, not just in the US, but globally on regionalization, localization, and remooring wealth and place, because that's really what's been lost in the last 40 years. So Heather and Felicia, I want to kind of sketch my paradigm of neoliberalism and see if you agree with it, and then get your sense on where we're going. When I think about neoliberalism, I think about the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. You know, taxes were slashed, markets were deregulated, global capital was unleashed, and the assumption was that capital, goods, and people were all going to be able to cross borders seamlessly, and guess what? Land where it was most productive for them to do so. The problem in this paradigm is that global capital moved much faster and sort of began to float 35,000 feet above the challenges of the nation state. And that has become an issue that we're all grappling with. So while you saw more global growth than ever before, particularly in the years leading up to the financial crisis, you also saw increasing and dramatic growth in global inequity in almost every country around the world, not just the US. That, of course, had economic and then political ramifications, and so that's where we are now. To me, the financial crisis, the COVID, the pandemic, war in Ukraine, all have been sort of like a scrim that's been pulled up and showing us the fragilities of the old world, from the debt crisis, the financialization, the imbalances in trade, the rise of an asset-based economy in the U.S. versus one on actual income growth and good jobs. Talk to me about how you see the paradigm. Do you agree with it? What would you add? Heather, why don't you go?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that introduction and setting the scene for us. And I will just say it's really great to be here and to see so many brilliant people and thinkers and doers out here in this audience. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you all and with you and with you, Felicia, today. Here's the thing. So much of what you've just described is a sense that the goal of economic policy was to keep markets efficient, and then that would deliver all the things that human societies needed. And I think what we have learned over the past half century is that just didn't work. And I think the way that we are thinking about it in the Biden administration is that we've come to the realization that markets need a little, and in some cases a lot, of help to make sure that the market delivers the goods and services that are in the national interest. And I think it's, and I hope that Felicia will talk a little about power and democracy in her comments on neoliberalism.
Power.
Oh, great. I didn't even see that.
Talking
That's
point.
Great. Talking points. But I think that the thing about what the president has made clear from the campaign on forward is that the goal of the economy is to deliver, to broaden, strengthen America's middle class. He talks constantly about wanting to build an economy from the bottom up and middle out. And what he's doing is he's setting out a clear vision of the kind of economy that the American people need, and recognizing that, okay, so now we need to use all our tools in our toolbox to get there.
Yeah.
And I think when we think about the label of neoliberalism or post-neoliberalism, it comes down to that fundamental point that just saying we're going to allow markets to be efficient and let them do whatever they want is going to not magically deliver. It just doesn't work. But then that opens up all of these new questions. And so as we're thinking about this modern American industrial strategy that John talked about, well, okay, there's a lot of questions in there. What are the really core goods and services that the public needs? How do we make those decisions? That's where power and democracy come in. How do we do that in the way that is the most efficient and effective and also meets the needs of communities? So instead of having one goal, we are recognizing that we have multiple overlapping goals, and that it's a maximization problem across making sure that markets can do all the good things that they can do, but that we are addressing issues around economic justice. We are making sure that we're not leaving any community behind, and we are taking just real pains to make sure that the economy that we're creating delivers for people in a way that is resilient, is sustainable, addresses the care needs of the human needs of people and communities. And so you're adding a layer of values. What we are going for is a set of values. And again, that's about power and democracy. And our role as economists is to help you get there using all of the tools in our toolbox.
I would say, just before we pass to Felicia, we're not just adding values, but value. Because labor has value, the environment has value. I think just to amplify what you've just said and stress one point, I think one of the reasons that neoliberalism has died so hard is that it was simple. People love simple. Journalists, I'm one, love simple. When share price is your only metric, that's really simple, but it doesn't make it true. So power and democracy, Felicia.
Yes, well, I will definitely talk about power and democracy, and you are right that neoliberalism is dying hard. We can talk about that, where is it, but part of what today is about is bringing in new thinking. So that's actually where I wanted to start. This day is structured sort of in multiple levels, right? We obviously started with John Podesta saying a lot about what the implementation of all of this legislation and this governing moment is going to need to look like. We are going to end the day with a really terrific panel of some of the people who are in charge of implementing all of this legislation. But we wanted to pause and take a step back now to say this is not just about implementation. It's also about this paradigm shift that Rana flagged, a very new way of thinking about our economy and economic management. So this multi-level thing is an important part of this moment. And I just wanted to say first that is why we are talking about this as a paradigm moment. And to that end, I 100% agree with everything that Heather said about markets and their both their shortcomings when they're poorly structured and some of the things that just fall outside of markets when we think about what we want in human life. And I think there are a few ways in which this new thinking about government as an affirmative, bold, loud and proud actor in helping to create the society and the small d democracy that we want. That is the biggest shift right now. And I think where you are seeing it is in a couple of different places. First, exactly where what your book is all about, Rana.
Thank you for that plug. Homecoming.
This is about, we spent a long time, my entire political lifetime, thinking about the virtues or maybe the challenges, but mostly the virtues of globalization. Thin supply chains, efficiency, lowest labor costs. And we talked a little bit about some of the problems with that, but mostly we talked about, it's so great, it was gonna bring us consumer's paradise, low prices. But what we are learning and what your book so ingeniously outlines is that all of the ways in which that does not work and all of the ways in which we need to be building and thinking locally for economic reasons, as well as for social and human reasons. So that's one of the first big changes, right? From thin and just in time to more resilience, more robust, more local, and I think in some ways more human.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? So then that leads to the second piece, which Heather asked me to talk about, and which I was planning to talk about anyway, which is the question of where democracy and power really plays into all of this. And to be honest with you, this is an enormous challenge, not just, or maybe not only exclusively for the people, for the government officials you will hear today, and who I'm sharing the stage with here today, but actually for all of us. Because I think one of the big fears out there as we live in this paradigm-less, maybe new paradigm, maybe not new paradigm moment, I think one of the big fears out there is that democracy is not going to be able to help us build as quickly, as environmentally sustainably, and as justly as we need to. And that democracy is just going to end up a big bowl of spaghetti that is going to make our collective lives even more complicated. There is a real movement out there that is asking those questions and perhaps positing that as sort of the starting point. And I think what we need to do is to move to a very different way of thinking about people's voices in building. We have to move to, and this is also a word that has been sort of taken off the table in government circles for a very long time, but we actually have to think about planning. What does it mean for communities to be able to plan collectively for their own futures? We've had tiny experiments with that in things like participatory democracy, but we need a lot more of that if we are going to be able to figure out where the wind turbine is, what we do with aging nuclear power plants. So this is going to be an enormous challenge. I think it is on us to figure it out, and that too will be, when we are really talking about that, that is when we know we will be in a true post-neoliberal moment.
Okay, so that's a good place to make 2 points, which is that one, as much as we think that this is some kind of new and radical conversation, it's not for the rest of the world. Newsflash. Almost every, not just China, but almost every other developed country in the world has an industrial policy. The US has been extremely unique in the post-World War II, actually I will say post-80s world. You can even go back to the 70s and we still had threads of industrial policy. But we're entering a new world in which the major competitors on the global stage are essentially state-run players, or players that have a lot more planning. So that's point number one. Point number two, even the economics profession is realizing that markets aren't always efficient. I have to say, one of my favorite all-time quotes from the beloved Joe Stiglitz, patron saint of markets not being efficient, he once told me it was not some great reason to win, or some great insight to win the Nobel Prize by saying markets aren't efficient. You just had to grow up in Gary. It's place-based economics, place-based thinking. So we have these sort of two new realizations. Where do we go from here? Heather and I have been talking a lot about this. Felicia, you and I have spoken. Where does the dot connection need to happen? Do we need more data about what's happening at the local level? Do we need more connection between different parts of the federal government? Where would you guys go next in terms of implementation? I'm going to jump a little bit ahead with that.
Yeah, this is such an important question. Let me say a couple of things. I used the word toolbox in my comments, and I was kind of thinking as Felicia was talking about the point, like, are we in a new paradigm, right? So let's just take one step back here. When we say this big word, this word paradigm, what we really mean is a set of ways of looking at a problem in a field of inquiry, where you're like, okay, this is how the people that study this thing all are agreeing. These are the questions that we ask. This is how we go about it. What we're talking about is that the way that we've been asking the questions hasn't been working, and it hasn't been leading us to the right answers. And so I think we are in a new moment, whether we admit it or not. And I actually think that neoliberalism is not going down without a fight. So maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah.
But the reality is that John eloquently laid out all the ways that this wasn't working for the United States, for American competitiveness, for the climate, for communities, for equity. So what is it that wasn't working? I think that, just to put my economist hat on, I would argue, and I think there's a lot of folks in economics who realize actually it's our toolbox that wasn't working. Ron and I were just at a conference, 24 hours ago in a different city. And the theme of this conference at Harvard was humility among economists. It was really quite breathtaking.
It was a new look for them.
It was, and it looked really good. It was a very attractive look. But one of the things that has been said time and again, and I wrote about this, we talked about this at Equitable Growth a lot, that as economics has moved from a theoretical discipline to an empirical discipline, this has opened up new questions, because once you start getting into the data and realizing that, actually what you're finding, and a lot of this, you think of the very famous work by Card and Kruger on the minimum wage, that upended all of labor theory, right? Because all of a sudden we find out that raising the minimum wage actually doesn't lead to lower employment, and there's been reams of research that is about this fundamental theoretical question, but what was so exciting is that real world data shed a different light on it. And that is the issue that is happening right here, right now, in the questions around competitiveness, climate, industrial policy, all of this, industrial strategy, is all about, is what we actually knew about the world true? And how can we bring new tools and questions to it? So one of the exciting moments is seeing economists who were, ideologically not there, not excited about this field of inquiry, saying, but once we got the data and we looked into it, actually well-targeted industrial policies can benefit communities. And listening to this one economist talking about how, part of the reason we thought it didn't work before is because usually those are targeted at places that were lower income. And so all else equal, they're still relatively lower income, but that doesn't mean that the delta, that their shift hasn't been important. And so that I thought, these are deep insights. And I think to your point, Felicia, on, planning, what it is that we need to do, I will say from where I sit, the thing that wakes me up in the middle of the night is that we do not have the analytic toolbox or the analytic infrastructure or the data at this point yet to be able to understand all the things that we need to understand about this economic transition. And at the scale and the speed and the scope that we are going, I'm looking out at labor leaders over here. We have to make sure that we are attending to the transitions that we're going to see for people and communities and workers. How do we track that with all of this opportunity? And as John said, we need to make sure that the opportunity goes to the communities that need it. We also know that there's communities that right now that are doing okay that are gonna need it. Where are they? How are we doing this in a way that is accountable? And we desperately need new tools. Happy to talk to anybody who wants to talk to me afterwards about how you're going to fund or build new tools. I'm all ears.
Can I just also add to all the journalists in the room, inductive reasoning is so important right now. I mean, I think journalism has a huge role to play in some of the data collection.
That's right.
And really, pulling in that felt experience from local communities.
Yes,
Felicia.
Thank you for saying that, because I think that one need in this paradigm shift is to tell the story of where people are either hurting or, even more importantly, where some change in policymaking or in power building is making a difference in their lives. And I think journalists have a huge role to play in that, because otherwise we risk, for most of America, all of this just sounding, and I say this with enormous respect for all of my economist colleagues, but it's really sounding like Charlie Brown's teacher, right? Like wah, 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 like multisyllabic words. Look, that's my day job also. I'm a political scientist, not an economist, but I read a lot of long papers. And it is incumbent on us, you all, who speak in other registers, to tell this story. That being said, there's one other, to go right back to the research needs, there is one other thing I'd like to flag around research needs, is that, this change, as John said, is going to happen on a macro level, yes, but it's going to happen not only community by community, but also sector by sector. So when a number of us were working early on in the administration on, I was the US representative to the G7 panel on economic resilience, and one of the questions was, what does it mean to be more resilient in semiconductors? What does it mean to be more resilient in critical minerals? And so, Todd Tucker and Steph Sterling and I started to ask around, because it was our job to figure that out for the US government. And the only people we could ask were the semiconductor industry. The only people we could ask were the people who ran critical minerals companies. And it is, of course, that's important that they have that knowledge to run their sectors, but it is also important, if we're going to have the right balance of power and the right guardrails, for others of us who have the public interest literally in our job descriptions to also understand that. So there's a whole lot more knowledge that we have to build to make sure that this paradigm shift is, again, more egalitarian and more democratic, small d. And then we'll just say, as I'm looking at Mary Kay Henry over here, one of the places where this knowledge already exists, sector by sector, is in our nation's labor movement. The IBEW understands a lot about electricity, right? People who work, who understands how our hospitals work, how our care sector works? Our labor unions who are, and the folks at SEIU. So it is incumbent on government, nonprofit sector, think tanky types, academics, and also labor to really, if we're gonna plan well, we need to share what we know in the service of actually better economy and more democracy.
Okay, we have tons of questions coming in. I'm going to ask one more before we turn to this. Let's talk a little bit about risks, and both you and John kind of flagged some of those things already, and you mentioned industrial policy implementation is complicated. It's complicated because there's a lot of voices in the room. There should be a lot of voices in the room, and once we get it right, it's going to be a lot better and more inclusive. But some of the risks, I wrote a piece actually when the CHIPS bill was passed saying, yay, awesome. I completely believe that we should have more redundancy and resiliency in semiconductors, kind of the lifeblood of the economy. And the idea that we ever had 92% of all high-end chips, concentrated in one very highly politically contentious island is insane. That is like the single most insane thing about neoliberalism, possibly ever. But I also have a friend of mine, Bill Lazonic, who does a lot of interesting research around financialization, said, okay, but wait a minute. We've got to get companies to unlock some of their wealth, because now every single industry is going to be coming and saying, we need to be subsidized, we need to be supported. And so let's talk a little bit about that. Where do you all see the low-hanging fruit to make sure that companies which have more wealth on their balance sheets than ever before in history, also more debt, PS, because of neoliberalism, but that's a whole nother seminar. How can we make sure that they are part of the solution here and everybody's not lining up for a handout? Heather.
Oh, I was hoping you'd go to Felicia for
You should. I was going to say you should.
You're just closest.
Yeah,
So.
We should both say, "Ask Mike Schmidt. He'll be here in the afternoon."
Mike Schmidt, I believe I saw Jigger Shaw arrive
Right,
already.
right.
I mean,
Like,
there's-
ask them.
There is a lot of implementation, but I think that one of the core questions, though, is that we do need to decide what we need to focus on. And the president, during the campaign, set out an agenda of which industrial sectors were the most important for resiliency, for investment. It was the core pillars of Build Back Better. It was obviously making the clean energy transition, seems like a no-brainer. It was obviously investing in care infrastructure. I'm going to throw out, seems like a no-brainer. And then there's a lot of other sectors where I think it gets a little bit more. Semiconductors, well, they go into a lot of things, but where, and this is where actually I want to pivot back to what you just said about knowledge. There are, one of the things that I have learned over the years about economics is that the field of industrial organization has become, it's not been sort of the
atrophy.
Yeah, that's a good word. And it hasn't been the field that has really been able to pull in a lot of folks that are really asking these kinds of questions, but yet there is a growing group of scholars, some of them are here in this room, who have been thinking about some of these really important supply chain questions so that just like we know around monetary policy, where some of the weak links are. And so I think that developing that skill set, developing that cadre of scholars who are digging in deep can help us get at where along the supply chains do we need to be investing, and where and how and why. The how I would leave to the executors that'll talk later, but the why is a fundamental question that is both about resiliency, where do we need it, but also where is it that we actually need to be meeting human needs in really important ways that we are not actually doing.
Yeah.
I'll just say to try to answer Bill Lazanik's challenge directly. It is very important that alongside all of the industrial strategy, industrial policy work that people in this room and people at Equitable Growth and the Roosevelt, sorry, I know you're not there anymore, but Heather's former organization, Equitable Growth, and the Roosevelt Institute, in addition to all of the industrial policy work we have done, we have also been doing a tremendous amount of work on corporate power and financialization. Rana, that's what your first book was about, right? And it's important now to bring these two things together because we now understand a lot about the ways, just to take one example, Bill Lazanik's example, we understand a lot about the ways that stock buybacks are good for executives and bad for the rest of us. Bad for workers and actually bad for companies. It means that money is going to the top and not being reinvested in human capital, new firms, new R&D. So that the fact that we now know that, and the fact that people in government and on the Hill and who are thinking about legislation now know that, means that there is a lot of effort to do something about that and to write those kinds of guardrails into, for example, the CHIPS bill or
yes,
the CHIPS law.
good point.
Now it is still not sufficient, I will add. We need to do even more, not just to prohibit the use of CHIPS money for stock buybacks. We actually need to go further and to prohibit that period. But that's why you still have. That's why advocates still have a lot of work on their plate.
So I love that you're focusing on incentives. We can shift incentives in the tax code, in financial regulation, in environmental regulation. And that also underscores, this conversation that we're having is often couched as, and will be couched often by the right as, oh my God, big government, we're getting more government. There's always incentivization and choices about interest groups being made by both sides all the time. You're just talking about different
and let's be clear, as John said, we've always had an industrial policy.
Yes, 100%.
It was not.
It's very American.
Yeah, we did a really nice thing out of the Council of Economic Advisors showing how much we've been subsidizing fossil fuels over the years and how that compares to what we need to do for clean energy. That's just one mini
100%.
example, so let's not forget that.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me go to some of these great questions that are coming through. This is one near and dear to my heart. In building economies that serve the national interest in local communities, how do we also mitigate the geopolitical risk related to economic nationalism? And I will add to that, I work for a British publication. I sit on the editorial board of the FT. My colleagues abroad are oftentimes, even in allied nations, very nervous, because they look at America and they say, wow, you've got food, fuel, consumer demand. You can kind of do this, hunker down thing. Well, what about a small country? How do we include allies and other liberal democracies in this conversation? Janet Yellen's spoken about friendshoring. What do you guys say to the rest of the world? Heather.
Yeah, I was going to say friendshoring. Certainly, I think that one of the, so a couple of the things here. We know that just like in the United States, other countries want to do what's best for their citizens, their populations. And this model around neoliberalism that has been, something that's been embedded in U.S. economic policy, has also been a set of ideas that we've also sought to export. And so I think that thinking about this pivot as giving all of us the opportunity to think about what is best for our countries and then to come together, still in multilateral and bilateral forums to focus on goals, collective goals, seems like the right approach. You think about all the work that we've done, that Janet Yellen, Secretary Yellen has done on the global minimum tax. This is a really important
huge
innovation.
Huge thing. Yeah.
Other countries want to do this. Yeah. Right, and the thing that's stopping it is actually U.S. politics, not our willingness to work, other partners' willingness to work with us. So finding areas of commonality where everybody wins and other countries are allowed to have economies that work for them. You think about climate as well. That's obviously an area where you need to collaborate. You think about other issues that are high profile around digital markets or market concentration. I think there are places where pushing towards more collaboration will be a really good thing for various economies. And and I think that the buzzword that, and I heard somebody sort of laughing there, but the buzzword, at least on my floor, the old executive office building, has been friendshoring. So let's give it a try and see how it works.
It's Felicia, I'm thinking about your the Roosevelt Institute's work on rewriting the rules so many years ago. And the first point was there's not one kind of capitalism. These are not rules that are handed down on stone tablets. They are, they take many different forms. And right now we're having a conversation about what are the rules of our system going to be going forward. Yeah, would you?
Yes, we are absolutely doing that. And I will just add that in direct response to that question, there will be some hopefully productive tension between the Buy American domestic sourcing requirements in much of this legislation and this question of being able to friendshore and or being able to build alliances with other countries that do share small d democratic values. I actually think there is potential for that real shift, especially within the G7, but hopefully also beyond that. And some of it is going to be absolutely necessary. We are not going to be able to just, for example, figure out how to source critical minerals without some kinds of broader alliances. But let's make sure that we can do that without, capitulating to, frankly, child labor. Which is where so we need to be able to do this in ways that meet our values, meet our economic needs.
I want to share one example just that goes directly to that point that I found fascinating. In researching my book, I spent a lot of time in the textile supply chains. And I picked that industry because it was one of the industries that was most hollowed out over the last 20 years.
Hollowed out in the United States.
In the United States, yeah. A lot of jobs went to Asia immediately after China's entry into the WTO in 2001. But what was fascinating is the companies that were left were extremely efficient and did a lot in the midst of the pandemic to stop making T-shirts, started making masks. They actually drove down the price of American-made masks from 30 cents to 10 cents. Now, Chinese masks are 3 cents. That's dumping because raw materials, even back then, were probably 5 cents, 6 cents more now. The price differential between, masks made potentially with child labor, slave labor, in geopolitically difficult areas versus a mask with high labor and environmental standards, maybe not that much different. And particularly when you add in the value of labor and environment, I think cheap is not cheap, and we're reevaluating what cheap means to begin with. Okay, I'll stop now, and let me just get one more. I think we've got time for one or two more questions. Institutions have power in this conversation. So what new institutions do we need for industrial strategy? How should we be thinking about implementation? Do we need a public bank? Do we need institutions that can coordinate with government and also counter the power of private capital? Heather, I know you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I think that do we need a public bank? I'm not going to weigh in on that directly. I am really excited about the accelerator.
You could point people to lots of different papers that you find fascinating.
Yes,
but
there
anyway.
there are, and yes.
Or I certainly could.
You
anyway,
can
I
also
could certainly do
that.
that, yes.
No, I mean, I think that I am very excited about the accelerator, and I'm very excited that you all have invited Jigar Shah to talk today about what the Department of Energy is doing to fund. And I think that to fund, especially in the clean energy transition, I think that one of the most important things is we do need new institutions, and we need institutions that recognize the scale and the scope of this challenge. And we do need to find ways to both rein in some of the private capital. I mean, clearly we do need to be doing more at the top of the income ladder to rein that in, and to make sure that we're putting it towards good use. I think that, as Felicia said, there's actually some really nice work that Roosevelt has done on, and now I'm like blanking on the name of the author, so I can't.
Saleh Amarova?
No, not Saleh. Actually, I was still thinking of Lenore's paper about, Lenore Palladino's paper, about how we think about how we go about industrial policy. And the role of making sure that we are making sure that profits are reinvested in productive activity. One of the things that we've seen over the decades as inequality has risen is that we've actually not seen as capital, as the level of profits to wages has been going up and up, that we've not actually seen that reinvested at the scale that one would think. So as we're thinking about new institutions, how can we make sure that the wealth that's being created is then put forward into good, productive use that is solving problems for people? And so one way to do that is to encourage private capital. You can tax it, you can have the government spend it, you can find ways to break up concentrated industries, you can find, you can take Lenore's list and Palladino's list of things that you can do to discourage stock buybacks, or you can develop public institutions like a public bank that can do that. So the point I'm trying to make is that there are a lot of different ways that we can go about it. I think the first step to getting to a solution is recognizing that that is indeed a problem. That we have there. I mean, it can never be said enough. I try to say this at every public event I speak at. We live in one of the richest countries the world has ever seen. Do we need to do a little cheer on that? Like everybody, like we know that, right? There is so much money. There's so much capital. And the problem is that it's not being invested in ways that are benefiting communities. So but recognizing that has been exactly what neoliberalism prevented us from doing.
Indeed. Quick last word, Felicia. Anything to add?
+1 on all the public institutions question and other institutions that whose muscle needs to be built. Institutions at the community level, organizers and people who live in communities who can make sure that as all of the federal funds become available, they are used and directed and benefit the communities that you write about in your book.
I will just end by saying Adam Smith, father of modern capitalism, believed that you needed a shared moral framework in order for markets to be efficient. So I'm glad we're talking about that today and helping craft it. Thanks to you guys both.
Thank you, Rana.
Thank you.
Thanks, Heather.